Hey guys, so today I'm here with my review of the Game Boy Advance. Now, of course, the Game Boy Advance was the third generation Game Boy, and indeed the last generation Game Boy, and it really did bring a lot of new things to the table. It's especially considering when you put it side by side with a Game Boy Color. The differences are really apparent. Nintendo changed a lot of stuff. A lot was for the good, but some was for the bad. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with a tour around the console. So, starting from the beginning, you will see it actually does have that wide display. The display, while by today's standards, isn't that great. Back then, it was really pretty impressive, especially considering, the Game Boy Color screen, etc., etc. Now, of course, there were a few downsides to this, but I will get to that a little bit later. So, over here on the right, you do have the standard A and B button. You have a speaker, which was so-so. Over here, you do have this standard Nintendo D-pad, as well as a kind of small start and select button. Flipping it over on the bottom here, you will see an on and off switch. You will see the headphones, as well as the little thing for the volume. Now, along the sides, you actually see it had these little grips, the little gray grips. It actually was kind of useful as, when you're holding the Game Boy Advance, it did give you a little bit more grip, and of course, mostly it was just for the looks, but not too bad either way. So we'll go ahead and flip it over here, and you will see that, actually I'll flip it over this way, and you will see that it's, you do have two extra buttons from previous Game Boy Advances. So you do have an L and R button, both of which are very nice, very comfortable. You're playing it, very, very nice to use. It also does have a couple of places for accessories, and you do have a link cable spot. One of the best features of the Game Boy Advance absolutely is the game library. It's very, very rare to see a handheld console, even a Game Boy, that has so many excellent games on it. And of course, the Game Boy Advance is really considered to be the pinnacle of, sprite-based gameplay, where instead of having 3D models, it was the great 2D sprites. And the Game Boy Advance was an absolute powerhouse. Now, as far as today, considering, comparing it against modern consoles, it's not that great. However, it's probably close to the Super Nintendo, I would say. But, it was plenty of power to go ahead and run a lot of really, really nice looking sprite-based games. So what I mean by this are several games. I'll go ahead and just pull out one right here. Pokemon Ruby, that was a great franchise on the Game Boy Advance. Another one that I don't really think gets enough credit was actually Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. A lot of the movie games get a lot of flack, but actually this one was really quite good, and actually some of the best graphics I've ever seen on the Game Boy Advance. Indeed, though, the Game Boy Advance library was not limited to just Game Boy Advance titles. Of course, as it is a Game Boy, it does feature full backwards compatibility with previous games. So, for example, you want to take a Game Boy Color game, and indeed original Game Boy game, you go ahead and slot it right in. Now, of course, it does stick up a fair bit. However, no big deal, you can go ahead and play them. However, there were two major downsides of the original Game Boy Advance. The first of which absolutely has to be that screen. And of course, before I was talking, I do like the screen quite a bit. It's pretty clear. The resolution's pretty nice for a console of this era. However, there was a major downside, and that was the fact that it does not support any sort of backlight. Now, this is something we take for granted today. Every cell phone, every game console, everything has a backlit screen. However, this Game Boy Advance was the last Game Boy to not ship with a full lit screen. Basically, if you've never played an older Game Boy, basically what this means is that you really can't play in the dark. You really need to be in well-lit areas. In fact, outside's about the best place to play your Game Boy, especially the Game Boy Advance. So that was a major issue. Really did limit where you could play the Game Boy Advance. The second thing was it takes batteries. So I'll go ahead and just flip it over here, and in fact you can see mine's a little bit torn up here. Of course, the battery doors break on these Game Boy Advances quite a bit. But as you can see here, it does take AA batteries, and really that was okay for the previous Game Boys. However, it gets really annoying. The battery life is not too bad on the Game Boy Advance, but it really did kind of take away from, how long you can play it. You always have to buy new AA batteries. So, those are the two major issues with the Game Boy Advance. However, really Nintendo did fix them with its predecessor, or with its successor rather, the Game Boy Advance SP. However, I will get into that in a later review. So overall, let's go ahead and sum up. the Game Boy Advance is a really, really great console. I mean, it's nice, comfortable to hold. You know, if you've ever held a PSP, it feels like kind of a smaller version of that. You know, you do have your very, very comfortable L and R buttons. You know, you have your A and B button. All the kind of stuff that you would expect to see in a Game Boy is here. The Game Boy Advance is very, very solid. However, I really can't recommend to go ahead and, if you really want to go and play through a lot of the Game Boy Advance games, I really have to recommend to go ahead and pick up a Game Boy Advance SP. You know, it does practically everything that the Game Boy Advance does, only that it actually does have a smaller design with the flip. You know, it has an actual backlit screen, rechargeable batteries. I mean, the Game Boy Advance SP is everything the Game Boy Advance is, plus some. However, if you are interested in getting a Game Boy Advance, perhaps, you know, you just want to start getting into it, because the Game Boy Advances generally cost about half as much as the SP variety. You know, you really won't be disappointed. I mean, if you don't mind eating through some batteries, just like a standard Game Boy, and, you know, having to play in a well-lit area, you will not be disappointed. The Game Boy Advances these days are really quite cheap, and, you know, there are so many great games that it's really hard not to pass up. So anyway, guys, that's it for my review of the original Game Boy Advance. Really solid console, just pretty much overshadowed by the SP. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching.